230 feet deep in the Atlantic Ocean lies a shipwreck, but this is no ordinary shipwreck. The wreck is a World War II German submarine, also known as a U-boat. It was named Yoo-Hoo. Every year, divers find new wrecks, but the Yoo-Hoo was an unusual find. All US, German, and British naval archives listed every U-boat that lay on the ocean floor worldwide, but had no reference to anything even close to the Yoo-Hoo's location. The submarine was a mystery, its hull partially intact but showing signs of violent damage. The conning tower was completely destroyed, and the deck was twisted and torn, as if it had been through a fierce battle or perhaps an internal explosion. But if it hadn't gone down in a battle recorded in the archives, how did it end up in such a sorry state? The discovery made headlines, bringing in a surge of brave wreck divers eager to unravel the mystery. Could it have been sabotaged, or perhaps carrying Nazi party members fleeing the fall of the 1,000-year Reich? The search was on. Divers like Chris and Chrissy were drawn to the wreck and its mystery. It was the kind of find that could make a diver's career, and Chris and Chrissy were determined to be the ones to unravel it. 39-year-old Chris and his 21-year-old son, Chrissy, had been diving for over 4 years. It all started when Chris took his first dive in Jenny Springs and fell in love with it, and it soon became a shared passion with his son and even his wife. Since that day, Chris has logged over 700 cave dives, and his son has logged over 600. The younger Chrissy idolized the true pioneers of diving and even stated, "I think I'm going to be the next Sheck Exley." This ambition drove them both to take on ever greater challenges, with the mysterious Yoo-Hoo wreck being their latest and most dangerous venture. The pair had already dived the wreck twice before, meticulously exploring the submarine's middle section, which included the conning tower and the control room. They were certain that somewhere inside lay the captain's logbook, an artifact that could finally reveal the identity and fate of the Yoo-Hoo. But the wreck was a challenge, even for the most experienced divers, and it was clear that this would be their most technical dive yet. The father and son were going to dive 230 feet to the wreck using standard air tanks. This would prove to be a massive mistake. Breathing air from a tank at certain depths brings about an impaired state of mental function. The air in a scuba tank is the same air we breathe on land. Our bodies only use oxygen and expel nitrogen back into the air during exhalation. However, underwater not all of the nitrogen is expelled. As pressure increases with depth, nitrogen is forced from the lungs into the blood and then into the tissues, including the brain. This can lead to a condition known as nitrogen narcosis, which mimics alcohol intoxication. And just like alcohol, the effects of nitrogen narcosis vary from diver to diver. Some are more susceptible than others, and the severity of the condition can change from one dive to the next. But unlike an alcohol buzz that lingers, the effects of nitrogen narcosis vanish quickly. All a diver needs to do is ascend to a shallower depth, and their mental clarity returns almost immediately. On the 12th of October, 1992, 60 miles off the coast of New Jersey, the weather had taken a turn for the worse. The waves rocked the Seeker, a small diving vessel that specialized in wreck diving. The captain warned the divers that the conditions were getting worse, and so this would likely be their last dive, not just of the day, but until next year. Chrissy was hesitant to enter the water, expressing concern about the rough seas. His father, Chris, mocked his bravery. But when the seas became even rougher, Chris himself became reluctant to dive. In response, Chrissy teased his father's manhood. After almost an hour of back and forth bickering between the father and son, they finally agreed to go through with the dive. It wasn't just their last chance until next year, it was now also a matter of proving themselves. The pair entered the rough seas, which were now battering the vessel, making it rock from side to side. As they prepared to descend, New Jersey State Trooper Steve McDougal was already decompressing alone on the Seeker's anchor line after finishing his dive. Chris and Chrissy, confident in their abilities, smoothly descended past him down the thick rope that stretched 230 feet to the wreck below. Steve, an instructor who had been diving for 18 years, noted how smoothly and quickly Chris and Chrissy descended, like the confident, experienced divers that they were. Steve knew that pretty soon they would both be joining him for their decompression. Upon reaching the wreck, the plan was simple. They would land on the deck of the sub and leave 3 air tanks, which would be needed for their decompression on the way back up, which should take around an hour. After dropping off these tanks, the father and son continued their descent down to the seafloor. They planned for Chrissy to go inside the U-boat to look for the logbook, while his father would wait outside in case Chrissy needed any assistance. There would be a guideline between the two men. This line would be Chrissy's safety device inside the U-boat. It would guide him out of the submarine when it became silted out, which was something that would be unavoidable when digging around the silty environment for artifacts. The father and son gave each other a brief look, and then Chrissy started to make his way into the submarine. He had to practically crawl inside of the wreck. Debris filled the floor and wires hung everywhere. Using a technique called the pull and glide, Chrissy reached out, grabbing whatever he could to pull himself through the sub. Some items moved and broke, others crumbled completely into dust. This hard work would naturally increase Chrissy's breathing rate, which in turn would only amplify the effects of the nitrogen narcosis, which by now both men would most definitely have been suffering from. His tanks would often hit debris and make a loud twang that echoed in various pitches inside his head. As he moved his way further into the wreck, Chrissy had to wriggle through a hatchway that separated the damaged control room from the captain's quarters. Once inside, Chrissy began digging and moving debris with one hand, the other firmly grasping the guideline reel. The more he dug, the more silty it became. Even the bubbles from his breathing caused so much silt to drop down. Chrissy was now relying on feel alone. His powerful dive light would have been useless here. At this point in the dive, about 11 minutes had passed since they entered the water. Now pressed for time, Chrissy began to dig frantically, desperate to find anything that could help uncover the mystery of the U-boat. He was so focused on his objective, and because of the zero visibility, he might not have even noticed the tunnel vision brought on by the nitrogen narcosis. As he scrambled around, his hands bumped into an object. This had to be it, Chrissy thought. He knew this kind of discovery would have put him in a similar league to people like Sheck Exley, his idol. He pulled hard at the box. It moved from where it was tightly wedged, but the movement of this box caused a shelf to his left to start slowly falling. Chrissy didn't see it at all, but a few moments later he felt a crushing weight drop onto his back. Back at the opening where Chrissy's father was waiting, silt would have come billowing out the wreck as the shelf hit Chrissy. Chris only realized that something was wrong when the rush of silt was not accompanied by a banging noise. Chris, the experienced diver, knew that underwater noise is muted and heavier vibrations are felt more dramatically. He held on to the opening of the sub where Chrissy had entered, holding his breath and listening carefully. He could hear screaming, but Chris knew he was suffering from nitrogen narcosis, and this was just one of the many tricks that it can play on you. Auditory and visual hallucinations are almost to be expected when you're under the severe effects of narcosis. But Chris's heart raced when he realized these were not hallucinations, but instead the real screams from his son. Inside the wreck, Chrissy was in trouble. Panic began to overcome any rational thought. Despite this, he tried to steady himself and do a push-up to get the weight off him. But this only caused him to breathe faster and harder and use up more of the rapidly diminishing air in his tanks. Chris dropped his extra tank and, without hesitation, went into the wreckage and followed the line, crawling his way through the same path his son had taken. As Chris approached the hatchway to the room where his son was, red and brown silt spewed out. He entered the room and, although unable to see his son, immediately bumped into him and reached out to grab him. As soon as Chrissy felt his father's hand, a wave of relief hit him, but the panic did not subside. Chrissy screamed for his dad to help him. His father leaned towards him, speaking through his regulator, telling Chrissy to get his shit together and calm down. After a battle to move the heavy shelf off Chrissy, both men desperately tried to find their way out of the now completely silted wreck in zero visibility with debris everywhere. Somehow, they managed to make their way out of the wreck, but their ordeal was far from over. The dive, which was supposed to last 20 minutes, had now stretched beyond 30. They were running out of time, and more critically, out of air. Once outside, the two men swam back up to the deck to get their air tanks for their decompression, but they didn't realise that they had come out on the other side of the wreck. Chris and Chrissy searched along the U-boat's deck for 11 minutes, trying desperately to find their air tanks. The effects of the nitrogen narcosis were now severely set in, and both men were far too disorientated to spot the air tanks, which were lying exactly where they had left them. Chris signalled to his son to follow him, and Chrissy did. They went back down to the entrance of the sub and picked up the extra tank Chris had dropped earlier. He clipped the tank to his son and signalled for them to ascend. This one tank would not be enough for the full decompression both men needed. It wouldn't even be enough for one of them. Because of the extra time they had spent at 230 feet, their decompression time was now about 3 hours, which meant they should slowly ascend, stopping at various depths. If they did not, their bodies would be like soda cans that are shaken and then opened in one brutal motion, their blood vessels blasting bubbles of nitrogen. Chrissy had the last full air tank clipped to him, and was in the process of switching to it. His father was almost completely out of air, and had no other choice but to make a rapid ascent to the surface, ignoring all of his decompression stops, in a desperate attempt to save his son's life, and possibly his own. Chris thought that if he could reach the surface and alert the others quickly enough, he could get some air tanks sent down so that they could both finish their decompression. But below him, Chrissy was having issues of his own. As if things could not have gotten any worse, his regulator started to malfunction. He switched to the new air tank and started breathing, but instead of air, only water came through the mouthpiece. Chrissy tried repeatedly to purge the regulator to fix this issue, but after several unsuccessful attempts, he also had no other choice but to ascend, also ignoring all of his decompression stops. Chris made it to the surface, and soon after, Chrissy was there too. On the Seeker, preparations were already underway for departure as the seas were getting rougher. One of the captains of the Seeker saw the men pop up in front of him. They both looked extremely scared, and he knew that they had messed up. He immediately shouted at them to get back down and finish decompressing, promising to bring them air tanks and a support diver. But Chris and Chrissy were not ready to go back down. They were both at their limit. Chrissy shouted back, "I can't breathe off my regulator. I'm coming aboard." Both men began swimming towards the Seeker, although they were not swimming normally and were not responding to any hand signals. Men on the boat threw a line to drag them towards the ladder. They shouted at Chris to climb up the ladder. Chris replied, "No, take Chrissy first." The excess nitrogen in their systems was now bubbling uncontrollably, causing unbearable pain. But even in his agony, Chris thought only of his son. "Climb up the ladder," they repeated to Chrissy. "I can't move my legs," Chrissy said. The bends were rapidly taking their toll, paralyzing him from the waist down. They were suffering from explosive decompression. Chrissy was finally pulled onto the boat, and a regulator was put into his mouth. He spat it out and screamed, "Everything hurts so bad." Chris, who was still in the water, bobbed up and down in the rough seas, grasping onto the ladder of the boat and saying weakly but calmly, "I'm not gonna make it." And just a few moments later, he became limp and let go of the ladder. Two of the crew members, who were wearing normal clothes, jumped into the ocean to retrieve Chris and bring him back to the boat. The Coast Guard was called for an immediate helicopter evacuation. Chris's breathing had stopped and his heartbeat was extremely faint. His son, Chrissy, ranted incoherently, claiming a monster had trapped him in the wreck. One moment he was in agony, and the next he was numb. At one point, the pain became so unbearable that he violently shook his head, begging them to get a gun and shoot him. When the helicopter finally arrived, both men were rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. Chris died on the way, and his son, Chrissy, died the following day. Before his death, during his excruciatingly painful treatment in the hyperbaric chamber, Chrissy stated that they were crazy to attempt that wreck dive with just air tanks. Their ashes were scattered in Jenny Springs, within the Devil's Cave system where they had shared many dives together. In the end, the father and son became part of the caves that they loved so much. Thank you so much for watching, and if you did enjoy the video, be sure to hit that subscribe button. But until the next true disaster, it's goodbye from me.